Welcome to the Infomullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the Infomullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. This is an interesting one because it again hits in my sweet spot of the study of violence and instability. Will there be movement in firearms regulation to reduce suicide, accidental discharge, domestic abuse, criminal usage, or terrorism? So first of all, if you go to the article, when I described this, I was pretty clear that there's not, like accidental discharge, there's not much more room left to give. There's probably a couple hundred accidental discharge deaths per year in a population of millions of firearm owners and hundreds of millions of firearms. So from a per capita basis, whether you go by people or firearms, accidental discharge is almost a non-issue. I think total, there's under 600 for the country. That's going to change. It goes 500, 600, 700. But it's, when you talk about 15,000 dead from homicide and firearms, another 30,000 dead from suicide, 600 accidental discharges, very little. Firearms are exceptionally safe if handled properly. Almost every accidental discharge is a case of bad handling, and I don't think you're going to see much regulation on this to change. There's just not much room to give. The other ones, suicide, domestic abuse, criminal usage, or terrorism. We'll talk about terrorism first. As I've said for a long time, terrorism is so isolated in its number of incidents that happen, and even with large mass casualty events where you have 25 people killed or 50 people killed, something like that, that seems horrific. It's still a rounding error to these larger buckets, and it's very, very difficult to put in place a regulation to the point where I have said for years, if you're looking at a policy in terrorism, don't adopt that policy because you think it's going to do something to solve that terrorism. Adopt that policy because you think it's going to improve something else and might have a beneficial aspect on terrorism. Don't make terrorism your main reason. The unforeseen consequences on a low frequency event like this will probably, or the unforeseen consequences or negative impacts of a policy will probably overwhelm the benefits on a very rare thing. And that leaves domestic abuse and criminal usage. Those of you who followed me know that most of the homicide deaths, and suicide too. When we talk about homicide, whether it's overall homicide or mass shootings, actually, the majority of these can fall into the two buckets of intimate partner violence, IPV, which includes domestic abuse, and criminal usage. That's the vast majority of, and by criminal, I mean criminal gang usage. That's where the most of these homicide deaths occur. Suicide, as a whole different bucket, is obviously twice as many as homicide. So suicide, if you did an order of magnitude, things that reduce suicide, that's the highest bucket in the firearm deaths, followed by domestic abuse and criminal usage are probably an equal measure, and then everything else is a long tail in terms of number. It goes down from there. So the forecast was, what are we going to see in all these different activities? And I said, there's nothing at the federal level. It's an election year, right? It's 2020. You've got, we just impeached the president. The GOP hates the Democrats. The Democrats hate the GOP. Trump hates everyone. Everyone hates Trump. No, nothing's going to happen at the federal level. That was not a hard forecast. That was a gimme. But I did go deeper into a state by state. And I said, there will be state by state expansions of red flag laws. And each one will be accompanied by its own self-generating weather system of online comments and outrage and things like that. And red flag laws are something I support, which may shock people because I tend to be less in favor of gun control and more in favor of violence reduction, but I do support red flag laws because they are useful in reducing intimate partner violence and suicides. Those are the two big buckets, not terrorism. I don't think red flag laws where they help with mass shootings and terrorism, that's going to be a bonus round that probably comes up once every 100,000 interactions. But far more useful is the red flag, and a red flag laws, for those who don't know, is where it's an adjudicated judicial process where there is some version of hearing, and it varies by state. We can get into this if people want to in another episode because people have opinions, but it's basically an adjudicated process where someone makes a concern raised, a professional or a family member, something like that, then evidence is presented and a judge can order the seizure of weapons in a case of a crisis situation, somewhat similar to someone being involuntarily committed if they are harmed to themselves. Red flag laws can be done in a suicide case. I fear he's going to kill himself. And they have shown, I have the evidence, they do reduce suicide deaths where they are implemented because most suicides are men. Most suicides by men are done with a firearm, and most suicides attempted with a firearm are successful. Take that firearm out of the equation, suicide rates drop, period. It has also showed benefit in IPV, intimate partner violence, because And it's not on, just because you have you've got a dispute or something. We're talking about situations where you have multiple restraining orders, you have stalking, you have harassment, you have threats. There's a buildup of clear indications. This can help, again, remove that risk and let things cool down. Now, I am a supporter of red flag laws. I know there's disagreement on that, but I'm also a big supporter on something called focused deterrence and pulling levers. This is an overall program I've advocated for a lot, which looks at criminal violence and intimate partner violence, and it's not even trying to get to a judicial proceeding. It's specifically trying to avoid law enforcement. So even though I support red flag laws, which I'm much more in favor of, is focused deterrence and pulling levers, unfortunately, there wasn't much expansion on this. It's very hard for programs like these that are violence reduction programs to get oxygen in a normal year, because half the people are talking about gun control and the other half are talking about not gun control. And I need to do a segment sometime about how all their arguments are wrong, or which arguments they're making are wrong and which ones at least have merit. But they generally spend all the oxygen in the room goes to that, and very little oxygen or funding goes to effective violence reduction programs. Now, these programs in place saw reductions of 17 to 25%, big reductions. Whether that sustains in the pandemic is going to be a question mark. Murder rates are up in most cities. I had made a mid-year forecast that overall crime would be down. I might have to eat my words on that. We'll see where the FBI comes out and the UCR at the when they publish it. But I don't think there was much expansion of this, and the pandemic circumstances definitely threw a monkey wrench in this. So easy answer is no, there's not going to be anything at the federal level. That was an easy answer in a forecast. There may be a more sophisticated version of this next time around. He's asking, how do red flag laws interact with domestic abusers who have firearm access at work? Good question. Pretty sure that when an order goes out, remember, there's been a lot of infrastructure for like anti-stalking laws and anti-harassment laws for two people who are in the same workplace. Red flag laws where employees have access to firearms is a bit newer. It hasn't been as well developed, and I haven't heard a lot of cases. So they're not used. These are not laws that are used tens and tens of thousands of times where you get a lot of case study up from it. I'd have to look into that, Jerry. That's a good question. Trisha's asking, has there really been a significant increase in domestic violence due to the pandemic? I don't know. There were indications of risk. So whenever you're talking about suicide or intimate partner violence, there are indicators of risk, which are like calls to hotlines, calls for referrals, support for help. Those are indications of increased risk. The outcome is when you actually have a report of a suicide attempt or completion, or you have an incident of domestic assault. And of course, domestic assault suffers from a reporting bias. Not all that happens gets reported, and especially when you're isolated in the pandemic. My forecast on crime overall in the pandemic was going to be that crime would remain at or no higher than any of the last 5 previous years in the FBI. That's for murder, aggravated assault, rape, and felony robbery. So I may have to eat my words on that. We'll see, Tricia. There was certainly early in the pandemic and throughout, there's been high indications of risk. Floods of calls in for support lines, floods of requests for help, people losing contact with their things. So there's a super high risk. We're just going to have to wait to see. That kind of data takes a while to put together. And it may be a while before we really know, because if the reporting was affected, it's already tough to report domestic abuse in situations like that. There's a reporting struggle in there. If that's been infected by the pandemic, it may be a while. Yeah. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the Infomullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the Infomullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.